Another thing that can be done for passive online attacks are what's called man-in-the-middle or replay attacks. And what happens here is somebody gets physical access to the communications channel or to the segment that they're on. And then they wait until somebody actually does some authentication. And then what happens is through the use of proxy servers or software that replicates proxy servers, they actually step into the middle of the communication. Now, sometimes when they step into the middle, they just simply record what happens. And they'll record the activity that goes back and forth from the client to the server or from machine A to machine B. Later, what they can do is replay that exact same segment of packets to that machine B, let's say, and again, they can receive authentication. Now, they don't really have to brute force it at this point because they actually have, if you will, a transcript of the communication that happened. So this is more of a replay type attack. With a man in the middle, what the hacker does is he actually makes the computer A think it's talking to computer B, and by the same token, he makes computer B think it's talking to computer A. So what happens is the communication is sent from computer A, it's received by the hacker, who can then either alter that information or perhaps he just wants to go ahead and record it but then pass it on to computer B. Now, some of the considerations that you have to think as far as a man-in-the-middle or a replay is that it is relatively hard to pull off. However, I will point out that there are a lot of modern hacking programs that make this a whole lot easier than it used to be. Now, in order for this to work successfully, computer A has to trust computer B and B has to trust computer A. So they both have to think they're talking to each other. In effect, he has to invisibly appear in the middle of the communications without letting either side know that he's there. So there are a lot of tools out there that will help this hacker do this kind of attack, but it can be a very, very successful attack. So, active online password guessing is a little bit different. With active online password guessing, basically what the hacker does is he tries different passwords until he gets one that works. Now, this works best when people or users have relatively bad passwords. In other words, they pick passwords that they shouldn't pick or passwords that are very easy to guess. Did you know that the 4 most common passwords that are out there are God, love, hate, and cat? And while that may sound very familiar and you're thinking, yes, of course, none of my users would do that, you would be surprised. And all it takes is a simple guess on one of these, and a lot of times a hacker can succeed. So this also works best when I have open authentication points. In other words, I'm not doing any kind of secure sockets or any kind of secure IPsec communication between point A and point B. In other words, I just simply say, hey, computer B, I would like to log in. B asks for my information, and voila. So this can be a very effective method for password guessing. Some of the considerations, well, it might take a long time. After all, assuming I haven't used one of the more common passwords, then they're going to have to guess and try a lot of different passwords. Usually, this activity is easily to detect because you'll see a lot of logins or a lot of activity on the network. In other words, why is Mary Lou trying to log on 57 times in the last 5 minutes? That would be one indication of exactly somebody's either physically trying to guess a password or perhaps they have some kind of other tool they're using to guess the password. So it can be pretty easy to detect if you know what you're looking for. And the reason this is such a success is people are people, and they have a hard time remembering passwords. After all, how many different passwords do you have? Just think about all the different accounts you have for perhaps your email or your online email account, or maybe you have a news group or a forum that you participate in, or maybe you just have different machines and different domains that you log in your organization. The odds that you're going to have the same password across all those different domains are very great. So all it takes is a weakness in any one of those systems, and now all of your systems are compromised. So again, this is something that takes advantage of the fact that people are humans and they have a hard time remembering. So you need to implement the proper security or the proper authentication scheme in your organization to ensure that people can't use bad passwords. In other words, make sure they don't do things like their birth date or any of the other information. So let's talk about another kind of attack, and that's an offline attack. Now this is a little more time consuming and it requires a little more work. What happens here is that the hacker actually gets his hands on files or databases that are stored on your systems that contain your different hashes or your different passwords. Now typically, of course, we're not going to store our password in just plain text because that would be very easy for somebody to get a hold of. So what we'll do is we'll store this in a hash or an LM hash, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But once the hacker gets his hands on this particular hash file, then he can pull that hash file offline and he can apply his different password cracking techniques, and you'll never know it. You won't be able to detect the activity because, after all of his attempts are taking place offline. So again, this is very hard to defend against. Probably the best way is to make sure that your users and that you yourself use good passwords. In addition, you can choose to have your different systems, for instance Windows, not store those different hashed accounts. But again, if the password or if the attacker can get a hold of that database, there are many tools at his disposal he can use to run against that file to try to examine those hashes and find out exactly what they are. Now, this used to be hashes, in fact, used to be considered very secure, but bear in mind now that hashing and cryptology has gotten to the point where computers are so fast now that they can try millions and millions of different hash and password combinations in a relatively short amount of time. And of course, computers are getting faster and faster and faster with each day. So what used to be extremely complex or considered to be very secure is now no longer secure. It only takes a matter of minutes to compromise. So some of the different kinds of offline attacks are, we have a dictionary attack, and this is basically where they literally try different passwords from a list. Sometimes those lists are available and they can simply download them and literally try every word in the dictionary. That's one of the reasons why you always need to encourage people to not use common words. Now, this will only succeed if they've used a word in the dictionary. However, loading that dictionary file and then running it against that password file is very effective, and it can be very fast. Now, a different kind of attack is a hybrid attack. One of the things that people can do to help make their passwords more difficult to crack is to use what's called a salt factor. In other words, to take your password and add some arbitrary value or arbitrary sequence of characters to the end of that particular password. Therefore, if somebody tried to implement a password attack or a dictionary attack against that password, they would not only have to figure out the password, but also the arbitrary value. One of the ways they can do this, however, is by doing what's called a hybrid attack. With a hybrid attack, basically you start out with a dictionary file, and then you take with that dictionary file and you apply every possible combination of other characters, symbols, numbers, and letters that could be added on to those different words. This, again, can be relatively fast because we have very fast computers nowadays, but it will take a little more time. Now again, if the salt factor is relatively weak, then it's not going to take much time at all. But again, this is another way that you can defend yourself, is by adding this salt value to your passwords. So the way they would crack that would be a hybrid type attack.